Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Javar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Peah, chapter 6, Halacha 8. One who harvests at night and one who removes sheaves. In other words, the Gemara is going to explain that, this is meaning somebody who removes sheaves to the threshing floor at night. And the Mishnah says, and a blind person are subject to the law of shkicha. That means that a blind person who harvests and removes sheaves during the day or night, that's what it's trying to say there. And over here, the Mara Fulda is pointing out that this ruling represents two novelties. First, although the produce in question is not visible to the person reaping and collecting it, it is still not considered hidden produce. So even though the person can't see it, and it might be hidden to him, it in general terms is not hidden produce. So we know that hidden produce is going to be exempt from shkicha according to Rabbi Yudah in the last Mishnah. And this is because the produce in these cases is in reality exposed. It's not merely visible to the reaper or collector due to external factors. And the novelty is that the forgotten standing grain or the sheaf is for not to be exempt from shkicha on the grounds that there's an external factor for causing it to be forgotten, namely that it was harvested or collected at night or by a blind person. So, we'll say that like the blind person is engaging at work even at night or blind, and it demonstrates that he does not consider the reduced visibility as a handicap to be an impediment on his work. And so, even though that he's aware of the darkness or his handicap, he's going to be careful and he's going to be thorough in his own way. So, that's not going to cause it to be hidden, even though he has a hard time seeing. And so if he's forgetting a standing grain or a sheaf, it's going to be subject to the law of shkicha, not because he's blind and it's like it's hidden, right? But it's going to be because you can assume that he found a way to work with some sort of efficiency and that he genuinely forgot it. So there's no waiver for people working in the dark. If you forget it, you forget it. And you can't say, oh, it was hidden and start making arguments about it. That's the novelty here. Mishnah continues, says, if he intended only to take the thick ones, he is not subject to the law of shkicha. What does that mean, the thick ones? So in Derech Hamuna, in chapter 5 and Halacha 55, he's saying that this case is not related to the preceding cases. Rather, it refers to harvesting and removing the sheaves during the daytime by a person with sight who chooses at this juncture to remove only thick ears. And so you could say that, he's leaving the other ones for later. He's just picking out the better quality looking crop now. He's going to come back to get the thinner one later. That's what the Derech Hamuna is pointing out. The Mishnah continues, says, if one says, behold, I am reaping on condition that what I forget I shall take, he is subject to the law of shkicha. So this is getting into a term or type of oath where he's basically trying to make a precondition that his forgetting will still be his and that it won't fall out of his ownership. And you can't make a stipulation that contradicts the Torah. So because you can't make a stipulation that contradicts what the Torah teaches, it's not going to be a statement at all. You didn't say anything, and it's still going to be subject to shkicha, even though you made this statement. It doesn't help you. Gemara is going to start and says, and it's going to clarify, this first clause about somebody who's harvesting at night, and he's, maybe he's blind, and they are going to be subject to the law of shkicha. Gemara reads, so the Mishnah is to be understood, one who harvests at night and one who removes sheaves at night, and a blind person who harvests or removes sheaves by day or night are subject to the laws of shchicha. So again, we're pointing out that in this interesting and novel case, that this this principle, in principle, it's going to be a work process. He has a work process. Okay, so Mara Fulda says that when harvesting or collecting, that um, that the mistake, it shouldn't, by adding these extra words, okay, to where you're saying that he's harvesting in the day or the night for a blind person, or they're adding this case of he's also could be reaping at night. You could think of it in terms of like the stuff being linked together. Okay, so what Mara Fuld is pointing out is that the Gemara is explaining that as though the Mishnah reads, the one who removes sheaves at night and a blind person by day or night, so the case of one who removes the sheaves is a continuation of the first case, whereas the case of a blind person is not. So what they're trying to say is they're trying to say, look, this guy has a work process. This guy, yeah, he has a handicap, or yeah, it's hard to see because it's night out and he's cutting grain, or he's bundling sheaves, or he's hauling it to be loaded for the morning. And if something gets forgotten, it's not going to be hidden because of the darkness or because of his handicap. You could come back and you say, no, he had a work process. It was rational. He was out there working. He wasn't so handicapped by this handicap of either darkness or lack of eyesight that he wasn't able to be unable to work. He was able to work. The fact that he was able to work and that there was some rationality to this method, even though it might have been very slow, or maybe it wasn't as efficient as when it was light time, or it was still enough. And that if it's being forgotten in this case, it's real forgetfulness. It's not a case of, oh, it was hidden, it was too dark, I didn't see it. No, you had a work process. You were choosing it to do it in these conditions. You had a rationality to your work process. And now this is genuine shchicha because you were impaired. Yes, I hear you, but you were still able to do the work, and you just genuinely forgot this. And that's what it's trying to show. That's a novelty in this, and it's trying to show that the ability to continue to work despite these other things, if you have genuine forgetfulness, it's not going to cause it to be hidden, and it will be property of the poor. It's a very novel and interesting insight, and it helps us to think about this in a much deeper way. Gemara is going to now talk about the next clause in the Mishnah, and says, if he intended only to take the thick ones, he is not subject to the law of shchicha. So the Gemara now is going to explain the ruling of the Mishnah. Rabbi Yonah says, the Mishnah's explanation does not end with thick stalks or sheaves, but extends even to thin stalks and sheaves. For instance, since he is wont to discern and take the thick ones, then even the thin ones are not going to be shchicha. So Mara Fulda is going to point out this very interesting way to phrase this. And he's saying that when harvesting or collecting thick stalks or sheaves, the thick ones that are forgotten are not subject to shchicha, because the reason set forth where you're saying, okay, I have, maybe the fertility in this area wasn't as good and it was better over here, and I'm gonna start harvesting in this area and taking out the thick, good quality ones now, and I'll leave the weaker ones for later, right? And so then you're forgetting something. You can't come along and say, oh, these thin sheaves that are standing, that this is going to be shchicha, because the harvesting process, he was going through areas in the field of different fertility, and he was taking out the areas that had better quality fertility to bring it to the threshing floor faster, and leaving his work process where he would get the less fertile areas later. You can't come along and say this is standing grain, this is shchicha, because he changed how his work process was. Or vice versa. Let's say he's going to do it the opposite way. He's going to take out the thin ones first, and then he's going to leave the thick ones for later. And perhaps he's even going to take out the thin ones, and he's going to say, oh, okay, I'm going to take out the thin ones now. I'm going to use it for animal fodder and hay, and I'll leave the thick ones later, and I'll get that because that's really going to be the crop. Okay, he designates it to be, the thin ones to be for animal feed and for feeding all the chickens and the straw for the animals, and then he's going to leave the good quality one for human consumption later. And then you can't have where the poor person comes and says, "Oh well, look at all this stuff that's not cut yet. These are all forgotten sheaves," and they're saying no, it's not forgotten sheaves. It was the prerogative of the landowner to harvest out based on different fertility areas. And this is not going to be shchicha at all. It's just how he chose to harvest. So that's a deep insight. I want to point out what Vilna Goan is teaching on this. He's saying that Rabbi Yonah's novelty is with regard to the thin ones forgotten during the second harvesting or collection, when he is concentrating on the thin ones. One would have thought that those stalks or sheaves are shchicha since they were left behind unintentionally. Rabbi Yonah is teaching that even this forgotten produce is not subject to shchicha, and this is because we attribute his forgetting the thin sheaves or stalks to his mistaking them for thick ones, which he does not wish to collect at the time, which is not a true form of forgetting, or because the forgotten thin ones will likely be remembered when he returns to harvest, or collect the thick ones that he intentionally left behind during the second collection process. And it's noteworthy that according to the Vilna Goan, these are the very same reasons that the thick ones left behind during the first harvesting or collection process are not going to be subject to shchicha. So that's another way to look at it, according to Vilna Goan. Vilna Goan is basically saying that this idea of to leave the thick ones for later, that we can effectively say that he mistook the thin ones for a thick one, and when he comes back to harvest it, he'll eventually remember it. So one way to interpret the Vilna Goan for this kind of work process is you could say, well, maybe he's dividing it based on fertility of the land, and you could say, well, maybe some of the thin ones are left over, and I'm taking the thick ones now, and there's some thick ones that are mixed in with the thin ones. You say, well, poor person can say, well, you took all the thick ones, and there's a few thick ones here next to the thin ones, and well, these ones must be forgotten. And according to what Vilna Goan is saying, what Rabbi Yonah is saying, no, they're not forgotten at all, because when he comes back for the rest of this collection process, he will remember this, and so it's not going to be subject to it. We're talking about when you're forgetting where you're not going to remember this. That's the key point of this sugya, is to really dig into your head that this is a permanent forgetting. The idea of eventually remembering it, that causes it not to be shchicha. We are talking about a case where it is forgotten and it's not going to be remembered because it's not by a permanent thing like a wine vat, or it's not next to something that you're going to come back to harvest in a few minutes, and it's right next to it, and perhaps it even could be saved from it. You could bend it down and bend it next to the thin ones, right? So in the work process, you can't come along and say, no, the thick ones belong to me. I'm the poor person, and you forgot this. He's saying that, look, eventually it'll be remembered. And by the way, you can still bend it over and it will still save it. The poor person could come along and say, no, but these are two different types. You've effectively split up the field into two different types, thin ones and thick ones. And you harvested out all the thick ones. And here, these thick ones here that you left, this is what you forgot. Vilna Goan comes along and says, no, it's still not shchicha because he would eventually remember it. That is the point. Gemara continues, says, if one says, behold, I am reaping on condition that what I forgot I shall return to take, he is subject to the law of shikha. And the Gemara is going to explain this very clearly as a rule in the Torah that comes up on everything, in laws of Kiddushin, in laws of Nedarim, in laws of Nazir, all over the place. Okay, and here's the point. Here's what the sugya says. Says, for he made a stipulation contrary to what was written in the Torah, and whoever makes a stipulation contrary to what's written in the Torah, his stipulation is void. And this is a deep, deep idea that is everywhere. We know that in Baba Metzia, Bavli 29, that, basically this principle that invalidates a stipulation that tries to override the law in the Torah. Since the Torah is going to assign forgotten produce to the poor, in this case, the farmer's preconditioned claim that he retains possession even if he forgets it is contrary to Torah law. So it's not going to be valid. And again, you can see a parallel to this idea in Bavli, Baba Metzia, page 29a. So just want to point out something from the Rosh Cirilio for deeper insight on this. He's saying that there's an exception to this principle with regards to monetary matters, so that if one makes a stipulation regarding a monetary matter contrary to what is written in the Torah, his stipulation stands. But in our case, it pertains to now our case does pertain to monetary matters, in other words, leaving produce out for the poor, and yet the farmer's stipulation is going to be void. And Rosh Cirilio is pointing out there's two reasons that are going to be suggested for why this is so. First is that leaving shkicha for the poor is a mitzvah, and it's going to be viewed because of that as a non-monetary matter. By the way, the Rambam holds that that's also the reason that in this case it's void. Because again, what makes this interesting, what makes this sugya interesting, is you're saying that, you made this stipulation before, and it's a monetary matter. And in monetary matters, stipulations that could contradict the Torah will stand. But over here, like what the Rosh Cirilio is pointing out, what the Rambam commentary is that no, shikha is going to be a mitzvah, and because it's a mitzvah, you can't override it. It's not really a monetary matter. Very deep insight, very, very deep way to start trying to dig in to understand this in a richer way. The second part of his commentary, Rosh Cirilio's commentary, is a stipulation regarding monetary matters stands because a person's stipulation is not directed at the Torah, rather at the other party with whom he is stipulating. In effect, he is stipulating that the other party waive their financial rights, not that the Torah law itself should not apply to him. So his condition will stand because of that. Okay. This case is different, though, he says, because this reasoning does not imply, because it is impossible to stipulate with all the poor that they should waive their rights and other entitlements. So what the other way to look at it, says Rosh Cirilio is basically saying the second way to look at it is that over there in other monetary matters, you're making a deal with a specific other person. Now, the other person can sit there and decide whether he wants to do this deal or not. And, says Rosh Cirilio, it's not directed at the Torah. The difference here, he points out, is that this now is dealing with a class of poor people. How can you get all the poor people to waive their right? It's not the same case as you dealing with one other person who's going to judge whether he wants to accept this deal or not. That because it's a class of poor people, and this is their entitlement under the Torah and is stipulated under the Torah, it's impossible to waive it. So that's two really deep ways to look at it and help to enrich our understanding of this concept with terms to monetary law, and also with regards to over here and how we should be thinking about the Torah in a much richer way.